Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into its weight. Allow your breathing to even out. There is no destination to reach tonight, no arrival to consider. The journey has already slowed. The path will carry itself. When you are ready, we begin. Tonight's story is called A Slow Walk Beside a Wide, Tidal River. The river opens wide before you, broad enough that its far bank feels softened by distance. It does not break or crash against its edges. It spreads. It rests into the land with a patient steadiness, holding a quiet amber sheen that lingers from the last light of day. The sky above carries warmth still, a diluted gold that has thinned but not yet vanished. That warmth settles along the surface of the water in long, horizontal bands. Nothing glitters, nothing flares. Light lies across the current like a fine layer of silk drawn gently over moving glass. The band of light is not fixed in place. It shifts by small degrees as the river's surface changes its angle. A line that looked smooth a moment ago becomes faintly rippled, then returns to a calmer sheen when the current evens itself again. The color is warm without being bright, closer to honeyed air than sunlight, spread thin enough that it never becomes sharp. Farther out, the water takes on a slightly darker tone where the channel deepens. The change is gradual. There is no visible boundary, only a slow gradient from lighter near the shore to deeper color toward the center. The horizon carries the same steady softness, a long seam where gold thins into muted blue-gray without needing a clear edge. Beneath your feet, the path transitions from gravel to packed earth mixed with silt. The change is subtle but distinct. Small stones give way to a smoother firmness that yields by the smallest degree under your weight. Each step presses in slightly, then releases as you lift again. The air carries the scent of tide, salt folded into damp timber, a faint metallic trace from old rings set into stone, and the mineral coolness of mud that has known both exposure and return. The warmth of the day still lingers within it, softened now into something rounder, more even. A wooden jetty extends a short way from the bank. Its planks have darkened over years of rising and retreating water. Some boards curve almost imperceptibly along their edges, worn smooth where soles have passed repeatedly. One plank bears a pale streak where its surface once split and was sanded down again, leaving a lighter grain against the deeper brown. The water does not rush beneath it. It moves with a long, tidal rhythm, drawing inward and then easing outward again in shallow increments that feel measured rather than dramatic. A rope hangs from a ring at the jetty's side. Its fibers have thickened with salt and weather. A single strand has loosened slightly, curling away from the coil without fully separating. The rope shifts by a fraction as the tide presses gently against the posts below. The movement is delayed by a breath, then settles. You step onto the first board of the jetty. The wood answers with a contained sound, not sharp, not echoing, a low acknowledgement. The tone disperses quickly into the open air. Out across the river's width, the opposite bank appears softened by distance. Trees merge into a single darker line against the amber horizon. A roof shape sits low among them, its outline barely distinct, its windows holding a dim reflection of sky rather than light from within. As the evening lowers another fraction, the far bank becomes less detailed, not because it disappears, but because distance compresses it into simpler shapes. The tree line reads as one continuous silhouette. The gaps between trunks stop separating themselves. A slight rise in the land becomes a gentle curve instead of a feature to note. On the water, reflections respond in the same quiet way. A darker stripe travels along the surface when a thin cloud passes overhead, then fades as the sky clears again. The river does not brighten or dim dramatically. It redistributes light in slow, horizontal adjustments, like fabric shifting when it settles into a new fold. The boundary between water and sky is not sharply drawn. Instead, the two meet in a gradual blending, where gray-blue begins to replace gold, and the surface below absorbs that change without resistance. You walk slowly along the jetty, each step deliberate but unforced. The grain beneath your boots alternates between smoothness and faint ridges where weather has lifted it slightly. Near the end, a small metal bracket holds two boards together. One screw sits flush, the other angles by a fraction, not enough to loosen, only enough to show that it was turned by hand. The tide gathers lightly against the jetty posts. Water folds around the timber in shallow arcs, then slips past. No splash, only contact. You step back onto the bank. The earth here carries the faint imprint of earlier footsteps, softened at their edges by the slow return of water. One bootprint near the shoreline has filled partially with a thin film, reflecting the sky in a muted oval. Its outline is still visible beneath the surface. The river is wide enough that its movement feels horizontal rather than directional. It does not appear to be traveling anywhere in urgency. Instead, it negotiates with the land in long exchanges. Water advances by inches, pauses, withdraws by the same measure. Amber light lies low across timber, reeds, and stone. It does not radiate, it lingers. Amber tones settle into timber grain, into reeds leaning toward the bank, into the faint rust stain that trails from an embedded ring down the face of a retaining wall. A narrow path follows the curve of the river's edge. It does not run straight for long. It bends in shallow arcs that mirror the water's line. As you begin to walk along it, the sound beneath your steps shifts again, from firm silt to a fine scattering of gravel laid in a thin strip to hold the bank steady. The gravel murmurs faintly underfoot. Small stones press against one another, contained and low. To your right, reeds stand in clusters along the waterline. Their stems are upright but not rigid. The tips lean slightly toward the river, responding to a breeze too soft to feel fully against your skin. The air is warm, but not heavy. It rests evenly along your collarbone, along the back of your hands. Farther along the bank, a piece of driftwood lies caught between two reeds. Its surface is pale where it has dried, darker where water has touched it more recently. A shallow indentation runs along one side, no deeper than a thumbprint. The edges of it have rounded over time. The sky lowers another degree. Gold thins into muted copper. Blue deepens by a shade. The transition is steady, unannounced. You continue walking. The river widens further ahead, where it begins to open toward the estuary. From here, its breadth feels expansive without being overwhelming. There is space across its surface, but no emptiness. The water keeps texture, faint ripples where the tide shifts direction, smooth bands where the current evens itself out. A small wooden marker stands beside the path. Its paint has faded into a neutral tone that once may have been white. Near its base, a hairline crack runs vertically, no longer sharp, just present. You pass it without touching, aware only of its steadiness. The scent of salt and damp earth mingles with the warmth still stored in the ground. The soil beneath your feet has held the day's heat longer than the air. It releases that warmth slowly, rising in faint currents that are almost indistinguishable from stillness. The tide presses forward another inch along the bank. Water meets mud in a soft seam that curves gently along the shoreline. The line trembles briefly where a shallow ripple passes through, then steadies again into its previous shape. Your steps continue at the same measured pace. The path continues beside the widening river, and you follow its curve at the same measured pace. Your steps find their place naturally between slight depressions in the earth, between scattered stones that catch, and release light as the sky darkens. A gull crosses overhead in a long, unhurried arc. Its call carries outward across the water and thins into the open air. You do not track it with your eyes. The sound disperses quickly into the evening. The wide surface carries the last of the amber light without narrowing. Across the water, the amber band grows narrower. The path follows the curve of the river more closely now, narrowing where the bank bends inward and widening again where the land opens out. The soil underfoot feels firmer along this stretch, less mixed with silt, more compacted from years of steady passage. Each step lands cleanly and completes itself before the next begins. The tide presses and withdraws beside you, not dramatically, just steadily. Water presses lightly along the lower edge of mud, then eases back, leaving a thin dark sheen that reflects the remaining warmth in the sky. The seam between land and river shifts by inches, never by leaps. You walk at the same measured pace. From this angle, the river's breadth becomes more apparent. The near edge feels close enough to study in detail: mud seam, reed base, the faint ripple where water touches land, yet the center holds a different quality altogether. Depth shifts tone without announcing itself. Lighter plains near the shore give way to darker stretches toward midstream, and beyond that the far bank compresses into a softened line where land and sky begin to resemble one another. The current does not travel in straight lines. It widens, thins, gathers again, tracing shallow arcs across its own surface before smoothing into a longer sweep. What looks still at a distance reveals faint motion when seen closer. What looks active from nearby dissolves into calm when allowed more space. The river shifts its surface in small adjustments across the open span, yet its width remains unchanged. A faint change in air passes across your hands, cooler now than moments before, though the ground beneath retains warmth. The balance between the two remains even. Nothing sharpens, nothing fades abruptly. Your stride stays unbroken. Gravel returns briefly in a narrow band where the bank has been reinforced. The stones are small and rounded, pressed into the earth rather than scattered loosely. They sound faintly against one another when your heel rolls forward, a muted, granular murmur that disperses quickly into the open air. To your right, the water stretches outward in long plains of muted gold and blue. The surface carries faint, diagonal lines where the current meets slight variations in depth. Those lines move slowly across the breadth of the river, then dissolve into smoother bands again. A low retaining wall appears along the bank, built from stacked stone darkened by years of contact with water. The stones are uneven in size but fitted with care. Near the base, a narrow streak of mineral staining trails downward, thin and rust-toned against the deeper gray. The mark does not stand out. It simply remains. You pass without slowing. Reeds cluster again near a shallow indentation in the bank. Their stems are denser here, forming a loose barrier that sways by a fraction when the tide reaches them. The movement is delayed, as if the water speaks first and the reeds answer a moment later. The air holds warmth still, though it has thinned further. The earlier amber now leans toward copper at the horizon. Higher up, blue deepens by degrees. The change is gradual enough that it feels continuous rather than transitional. Your steps continue in quiet sequence. Heel, roll, lift. The ground absorbs the sound of it. Farther ahead, the river widens again where a small inlet meets the main flow. The meeting is subtle. No splash marks the joining. Instead, a faint shift in texture appears where the narrower current merges with the broader tide. A soft interference pattern forms briefly, then smooths out into a shared direction. The path bends inward around the inlet, drawing you closer to the water's edge. Here, the mud shows faint striations left by earlier retreat. Thin lines curve along its surface, pressed there when the tide was lower and firmer. They hold their shape for now. You step around them without disturbing their arc. The warmth stored in the ground rises in slow currents you cannot see, but can feel faintly against your ankles. It balances the cooler breath of water moving beside you. Neither dominates. The temperature rests in equilibrium. A narrow wooden railing begins along this stretch, set a short distance from the drop to the bank below. The wood has silvered in places and darkened in others. One section bears a shallow scuff near its midpoint, as if a bicycle pedal once struck it and left a pale crescent in the grain. The edges of the mark have softened over time. You pass your hand lightly along the top of the railing as you walk. The surface is smooth but not polished. It carries faint undulations where the grain rises and falls. Your palm moves with those contours for a few steps, then lifts away again. The river continues its measured negotiation with the shore. Out across its width, the far bank grows less distinct as light lowers further. What earlier appeared as individual trees now merges into a continuous silhouette. The horizon line flattens slightly, less varied, more even. A gull crosses at a lower height this time, gliding over the inlet before rising again toward the open stretch beyond. Its wings tilt once in adjustment, then steady. The sound it makes is brief and contained. You do not alter your pace. The path levels out into a broader section where grass grows shorter and the earth feels drier beneath the surface. The gravel disappears again, replaced by a smoother firmness that supports your weight without shift. Your stride remains even. The river's surface darkens subtly toward its center, where depth increases. Near the edges, lighter tones persist, reflecting what remains of the sky's warmth. The gradient between the two is soft, almost imperceptible. A small wooden platform sits slightly back from the bank, low to the ground and square in shape. It appears too small to serve as a dock, more like a place once used for observation. The boards are closely set. Near one corner, a single nail head catches the last trace of copper light, its top dulled but faintly reflective. You continue past it without stepping up. The inlet you passed earlier has already blended fully into the main tide. Its outline is no longer distinguishable. The water there carries the same steady plane as the rest of the river, moving inward and outward in increments too small to measure. The sky lowers another fraction. Copper fades toward muted rose near the horizon, while the upper air deepens into steadier blue. No sharp contrast divides them. The colors overlap softly, settling into each other without insistence. You walk alongside the widening river, the rhythm of your steps unbroken. The sound of water against mud grows quieter as the tide evens out. Where earlier you noticed small adjustments along the seam, now the line appears smoother, less interrupted. The boundary remains visible but less active. Your pace does not change. The railing ends. The path opens into a longer stretch of open bank where no barrier separates you from the drop toward the water below. The earth here slopes gradually, making the transition between path and shore feel continuous rather than abrupt. You keep to the higher line. Across the river's breadth, a faint shift in surface texture travels diagonally, likely the result of a deeper channel guiding the tide beneath. The change appears, stretches thin, then dissolves. Nothing accelerates. The warmth in the air settles lower as the last amber light thins further. The copper band narrows, pressed closer to the horizon now, while blue gathers above it. Along the shoreline, the seam between water and earth shifts by a narrow measure. A thin advance presses into a shallow indentation in the mud, pauses, then recedes again, leaving behind a faint gloss that mirrors the sky in miniature. The movement is subtle enough that it could be missed if watched only once. Seen over several breaths, it becomes clear that the boundary is never fixed. Where the bank slopes more gradually, water spreads into a shallow fan before drawing back, smoothing over earlier irregularities without erasing them completely. Lines in the mud soften at their edges, then reappear as the tide adjusts its angle. Nothing here behaves in extremes. The changes are incremental, patient. You continue walking. The open stretch ahead carries the same evenness as the river beside it. The path bends gently out of sight, and the water follows a parallel arc. Across the wide surface, darker bands settle toward the center, while the remaining warmth holds near the edges, thinning but not disappearing. The sky above deepens another shade, steady and unforced. Ahead, the bend gathers both path and water into the same gradual arc. The path narrows again where the bank curves inward, bringing the water closer to your line of travel. The drop to the shoreline is gentler here, not abrupt but sloped, the earth settling downward in a gradual incline. The seam between land and river feels nearer, more detailed. Along this stretch, the mud holds a faint gloss where the tide has recently touched it. The surface reflects the dimming sky imperfectly, carrying blurred fragments of copper and blue that tremble whenever the water presses forward. A thin edge forms, pauses, and eases back. You move a little closer to the slope. The earth beneath your feet remains firm, though the top layer feels cooler now. Warmth stored from the day thins as evening lowers. The balance shifts quietly, not toward cold, only toward neutrality. A low wooden bench appears a short distance ahead, positioned to face the broad span of water. Its shape is simple, square-backed, built without ornament. The boards have weathered into a pale tone where sun has struck them over years. Near the center of the seat, a faint, darkened oval marks where rainwater has pooled repeatedly and dried again. You slow as you reach it. The river keeps its same low rhythm. Across the water, the far bank has become less distinct than before. Tree shapes merge fully into silhouette, their separation absorbed by the lowering light. The horizon line appears flatter, more continuous. You rest your hand along the back of the bench without sitting. The wood feels cooler than earlier surfaces you touched, its warmth surrendered to air. The grain beneath your palm carries shallow ridges that rise and fall in subtle intervals. Your fingers trace those contours briefly before lifting again. The tide reaches forward another inch along the seam below. A faint, single tone carries across the water, delicate, metallic, likely from a buoy adjusting against its chain somewhere beyond view. The note arrives cleanly and dissolves without echo. The river resumes its low, layered hush. You remain standing for a moment longer, the bench steady at your side. From this still position, the river reads differently. Movement that felt broad while walking now separates into smaller variations. Near the bank, a faint series of ripples travels inward at an angle, their edges soft and unhurried. Toward midstream, the surface carries a darker plane that shifts by degrees rather than direction. The difference between shallow and deep water becomes more visible when you are not moving. The bench holds its shape without adjustment. A thin line of shadow gathers along the underside of the seat where light no longer reaches. Along the backrest, the fading copper tone settles unevenly, caught briefly on raised grain before thinning into cooler gray. Nothing about the wood changes, only the light redistributes itself across it. The seam below advances once more, touches the lower edge of mud, and withdraws again, leaving a slightly broader sheen than before. The gloss reflects the horizon in miniature, trembling faintly until the surface steadies. No sharp change interrupts the scene. Beyond the inlet passed earlier, the main channel shows a slight deepening in tone toward its center. Near the edges, lighter planes persist where the last warmth of sky still lingers. The gradient between them grows softer as light thins. You step away from the bench and continue along the path. Gravel does not return here. The soil remains smooth, compacted by time. Each footfall settles evenly before the next begins. The slope to your right remains visible, but less sharply defined now that shadow has gathered along its lower edge. Air moves across the surface of the river in faint currents. The movement is not strong enough to disturb the broader tide, but sufficient to shift small ripples along the near shore. Those ripples meet mud and dissolve into shallow gloss. The air does not travel in a single direction. It shifts in layered passes, one thin movement crossing the water while another moves higher, barely perceptible except where it brushes the upper reeds. Across the wide span, surface patterns respond unevenly. Near the center, darker bands elongate and relax. Nearer the bank, small ripples intersect and dissolve. The sky above continues its gradual transition, copper narrowing toward rose while the upper blue deepens without hardening. The scent of brine grows slightly clearer as warmth thins, mingling with mineral earth and damp grass in proportions that feel balanced rather than dominant. From this distance, the far bank has lost its smaller variations, reading now as a single continuous contour against the lowering light, neither advancing nor receding, simply present as the river maintains its breadth beneath it. The seam adjusts again. In places where the bank dips more gradually, water spreads thinly before drawing back, smoothing the earlier lines left by retreat. No pattern lasts long enough to fix itself. The path widens slightly, allowing more space between you and the edge. Grass grows thicker along this stretch, bending softly where earlier water pressed against it. The blades have lifted again, though not fully upright. Your stride remains measured. A narrow post stands near the path's inner edge, once painted white, now faded to a subdued tone. A thin line of darker wood shows through where paint has worn away from repeated touch. The mark is not recent. It has rounded over time. You pass without pausing. The sky lowers another fraction. Copper leans further toward muted rose near the horizon. Above it, blue deepens, though still translucent. No star appears yet. The transition remains gradual. Across the breadth of the river, a darker band travels slowly along the center channel, marking deeper water beneath. The band elongates, then thins, then merges again into the broader surface. Your steps continue at the same measured pace. The sound beneath your steps is muted by earth rather than stone. Gravel has fully disappeared from this stretch. The compacted ground receives your weight without shift. Closer now to the waterline, the scent of brine carries more clearly. It mingles with damp grass and mineral earth. The combination feels balanced rather than sharp. A small wooden platform sits partially recessed into the slope below, no larger than a few boards joined together. It appears to have been used for sitting or setting down a bag long ago. One corner of it sits slightly lower than the others, the wood having settled unevenly over time. You do not step onto it. Instead, you continue walking parallel to the edge. The tide presses forward again, contacting the base of reeds in a shallow arc. The stems bend by a fraction, then lift once the water eases back. The exchange is delayed, like breath following motion. The path bends gently ahead, curving in tandem with the river's line. Both move in parallel arcs, neither abrupt nor straight for long. The warmth in the air diminishes another degree. The cooler layer now rests more consistently along your hands and face, though the ground beneath still carries a trace of stored heat. The two temperatures meet and balance. A faint cloud crosses the lowering band of color near the horizon, softening it further. The river responds not by dimming, but by redistributing what light remains across its surface. You walk on. The bench behind you fades into shadow. The post along the path becomes less distinct. The inlet is no longer visible as a separate feature. All elements settle into broader shapes. The river's movement holds its even rhythm. Where earlier the seam appeared active in small increments, now it seems smoother, less animated. The line between water and land is still present, but quieter. A subtle advance gathers along a shallow depression in the bank, filling it by a narrow measure before easing back again. The water leaves behind a slightly darker outline, tracing the curve that had been pressed into the mud earlier in the day. That outline remains visible for a few moments, then softens at its edges as the surface dries in cooling air. Nothing abrupt defines the exchange. Each motion follows the previous one without emphasis. Your pace does not vary. Across the wide tidal span, the darker center channel guides the current inward while the shallower edges hold a softer tone. The difference is visible, but not dramatic. Evening deepens without announcement. Ahead, both path and river bend into the same gradual arc. Across the broad surface, darker planes settle toward the center, while the remaining warmth lingers faintly near the edges, thinning as the sky darkens by another subtle shade. The curve ahead gathers you into a quieter stretch of bank where the slope lowers further toward the water. The path remains firm, though its edge softens into grass that leans gently toward the river's line. No barrier separates you from the gradual descent. The tide reaches forward again. This time, the movement feels less like a press and more like a widening water spreading thinly along a shallow depression before easing back, leaving the surface darker where it has touched. The gloss does not hold for long. Air cools it quickly, returning it to matte earth. Your pace does not alter, yet the sense of distance shifts slightly. The far bank, once a separate feature, now reads more as tone than as shape. Its darker line blends into the deepening sky above it, and the river between feels less like a span to cross and more like a broad surface existing on its own plane. Footsteps continue in steady sequence. The sound beneath them grows softer as the soil absorbs more than it releases. What earlier carried faint gravel texture now yields only a muted compression that settles immediately. A thin mist begins to gather just above the surface of the water, not dense enough to obscure, only enough to blur the sharper contrast between darker center channel and lighter edges. It rests low, almost indistinguishable from the river itself. The seam between land and tide becomes less defined. Closer to your feet, the slope shows faint irregularities that earlier light made visible. Now those variations soften. Small ridges in the mud lose their sharper edges as shadow gathers along their sides. The darker outline left by the last advance of water remains, though it appears less distinct than moments before, blending gradually into the surrounding earth. Out toward midstream, the deeper channel carries a steadier tone. What once read as contrast between light and dark now appears more like adjacent fields of similar color, separated only by subtle variation. The surface no longer reflects long bands of warmth. Instead, it carries shorter, compressed shapes that shift quietly with the tide. The horizon adjusts in the same measured way. Where sky met water in a clearer line earlier, now the boundary reads as tonal difference rather than edge. The two layers rest closer together in shade, though still separate. Your steps remain steady along the upper line of the path. Beneath the edge of the grass, the soil shows faint transitions in color where earlier moisture has dried unevenly. Darker patches soften into lighter earth without clear boundary, the variation subtle enough that it becomes visible only when watched for a moment. The slope below carries a thin gradient of shadow, deepening toward the water's line. Out toward midstream, the darker channel steadies further, its variations smoothing into a more uniform plane. The faint mist hovering above the surface gathers slightly closer to the water now, blurring small surface distinctions that were sharper before. The horizon continues its quiet adjustment. The tonal difference between water and sky reduces by another subtle measure, not because one disappears, but because both settle toward similar depth of shade. Near your feet, the seam remains active, though its movement appears less pronounced than earlier. A narrow advance forms, hesitates, and withdraws, leaving behind only a softening of the mud's texture rather than a defined edge. The path carries you forward without interruption. Where earlier you could trace its exact curve, now it appears diffused by shadow and soft light. The boundary still exists. It simply asks less attention. Air brushes lightly across your face. The cooler layer that has been forming gradually now settles more evenly along your skin. It does not displace warmth entirely. It coexists with the residual heat rising faintly from the ground. Across the river's breadth, darker plains align themselves more smoothly with the deepening sky. Reflections shorten as light lowers. What once stretched in long amber bands now compresses into smaller fields of muted tone. Across the broad span, surface, and sky begin to resemble one another more closely, not through disappearance, but through alignment of tone. The center channel deepens, while the shallower edges hold a dimmer echo of what remains above. Reeds along the near bank appear darker at their bases and lighter at their tips where the last diffuse light rests. Air moves in layered currents that do not disturb the wider tide, but adjust its finer textures. The scent of brine recedes slightly as temperature lowers, replaced by the mineral presence of damp soil cooling beneath open air. No element quickens. Instead, elements compress gently toward a shared range of color and shadow, settling into a broad field that holds both path and river without demanding attention from either. You continue along the edge. The bench behind you is no longer visible as a distinct object. It has become part of the darkening margin of land. The post fades similarly. Individual forms give way to broader shapes. Nothing is lost. It is simply less outlined. The river holds its wide span, though its center now reads as a deeper shade than before. The shift is gradual enough that it feels continuous rather than transitional. Your breathing remains unforced. The scent of brine softens as temperature cools, replaced slightly by the mineral dampness of evening soil. Neither dominates. A faint ripple crosses the near surface, catching what little copper remains near the horizon before dissolving into the broader field of blue. The path bends again. Grass along its edge carries faint silver where the last light catches blade tips. Below, shadow gathers more confidently along the slope. Walking continues, not toward anything, simply forward. The water's exchange with land persists in quiet cycles, advance, pause, retreat, though the differences between each phase grow subtler as light thins. What earlier appeared as defined movement now reads as slow modulation. The sky deepens another shade. The copper near the horizon reduces to a narrow seam before dimming further into rose gray. Above, blue steadies and darkens, though not yet into night. Across the open span, the far bank has nearly merged with the sky, separated only by a faint tonal difference that shifts depending on where you look. Your stride stays measured, yet the sense of width alters slightly. The river no longer feels expansive in contrast to you. It feels present in the same way the path is present, neither distant nor near, simply occupying space evenly. Across the wide span, depth, and distance begin to read as layers within the same dimming field rather than as separate planes. The darker center no longer contrasts sharply with the shallower edges. Instead, it rests within them as a deeper register of the same tone. Reeds along the bank register as vertical strokes against a broadening wash of blue-gray, their outlines intact but less insistent. The remaining warmth near the horizon thins further, compressing into a narrow band that neither brightens nor fades abruptly, but shifts slowly toward cooler shade. The air deepens in tone, as if the space between forms has filled with dimmer color. The sound beneath your steps grows quieter still, not absent, just absorbed more completely. The slope, the seam, the open water, and the horizon begin to share a closer range of shade, reducing contrast without removing form. The river continues its measured exchange with the land, though each phase blends more smoothly into the next. A soft breeze crosses diagonally, just enough to tilt reed tops along the shore. The motion is small, delayed, and then resolved. For a brief stretch, no sound carries distinctly across the water. The faint metallic tone from earlier does not return. Even the small ripples at the seam appear quieter as shadow pools along the lower bank. The darker center channel becomes more uniform, less varied in appearance. The slope beneath the path gathers shadow along its base, leaving the upper line clearer by comparison. The distinction between foreground and distance reduces by another subtle measure. What stands near and what lies across the span feel arranged within the same dimming plane. Movement continues at the same pace. Water reaches into a shallow curve, lingers, and withdraws, smoothing its own trace. Shadow gathers more confidently now along the lower bank. The distinction between slope and waterline reduces as darker tones merge. What earlier appeared as layered depth, grass above, mud below, gloss at the edge, now reads as a single graduated descent. Across the span, the far bank holds steady in silhouette. Its separation from the sky is visible only by a thin variation in shade that shifts depending on where your gaze settles. The river between appears broader not because it expands, but because fewer surface variations interrupt its span. A faint movement travels across the center channel, too subtle to isolate as wave or ripple. It alters the surface momentarily, then dissolves back into the larger field. Your pace remains even. The evening air cools by another degree, and the residual warmth rising from the ground becomes less noticeable than before. Ahead, the curve of the bank gathers both path and water into the same gradual line. Across the surface, darker tones settle more evenly, while the remaining light thins into a narrow band near the horizon. The mist resting above the river lowers slightly, softening small variations in the center channel. The seam at the shoreline adjusts once more, its advance and retreat nearly indistinguishable from one another. Grass along the upper edge holds a faint residual silver before dimming further. The broad field of river, sky, and shore remains in quiet alignment as evening deepens by another unmarked degree. Along the upper line of the bank, the path continues, though its boundary feels less defined than before. What separates earth from grass now appears as gradual variation rather than edge. The ground beneath your steps remains firm, but the distinction between surface and slope carries less emphasis. Water meets land in the same measured exchange. Advance, pause, withdraw. This sequence persists, though the differences between each phase appear softer now, less distinct from one another. Where earlier you could mark the moment of contact, now it blends more evenly into the broader field of movement. Your stride maintains its pace, yet the sense of placement shifts slightly. The river no longer occupies a position clearly to your right. Instead, its presence feels distributed across the open span, not closer, not farther, simply extending outward in even measure. The far bank remains visible as tonal separation, though it no longer draws attention as a separate plane. Mist resting above the surface lowers another fraction. It does not thicken. It spreads thinly, reducing contrast rather than obscuring detail. Small surface variations become less prominent as tone evens across the center channel. Sound carries differently here. The faint compression of your steps merges more readily with the river's low modulation. What earlier registered as separate layers, foot against soil, water against mud, now reads as part of the same muted rhythm. No element dominates. Beneath the path gathers shadow evenly from top to bottom. Grass along the upper edge retains faint residual light, though it dims steadily. The lower bank merges more fully with the seam at the waterline. Your movement continues. Distance alters again. The horizon no longer appears as a fixed boundary between sky and water. Instead, it registers as a gentle shift in shade within a continuous field. Looking outward does not extend space so much as confirm its breadth. Midstream, the darker channel deepens further in tone, though its edges blend more gradually into the shallower margins. The river's width remains constant, but its internal divisions feel less pronounced. Air settles more evenly across your face and hands. The cooler layer that earlier rested lightly now distributes without noticeable change in temperature. Warmth rising from the ground diminishes further, though not abruptly. The two merge toward neutrality. The seam along the shoreline advances again. This time, the movement is nearly indistinguishable from stillness. Water reaches forward in a shallow curve, holds for a fraction, and recedes with little visible alteration left behind. The darker trace it leaves softens quickly in the cooling air. A slight inward bend carries the path closer to the seam, yet the bend feels less directional than before. The curve of land and the arc of water mirror one another, so closely that movement along one appears to echo movement along the other. Your pace remains measured. Sound continues to soften. The earlier metallic tone does not return. No distinct call crosses the span. Even the faint ripple at the seam seems absorbed into the broader hush of evening. Across the wide field, forms align more closely in shade. Reeds along the bank register as vertical strokes against dimming blue-gray. The far bank rests as a continuous silhouette, its separation from sky defined only by a slight tonal shift that adjusts depending on where you look. The distinction between near and far reduces another subtle degree. The path beneath your steps maintains its firmness, yet the sensation of direction carries less emphasis. Where earlier each bend marked a change in alignment, now curves register as continuation rather than turn. The upper line of the bank and the arc of water mirror one another closely enough that movement along either appears synchronized. Midstream, the darker channel steadies further, its internal variations softening into a broader plane. The shallower margins no longer contrast sharply. They rest within the same range of dimming tone. The mist hovering above the surface spreads fractionally wider, reducing small disruptions in texture. Near your feet, the seam advances again, though the moment of contact is almost indistinguishable from the moment before it. Water touches mud and recedes without leaving a sharply defined trace. Orientation remains intact. It simply requires less adjustment. Footsteps settle into earth. Water settles into shore. Air settles into surface. None collapse into one another. They simply share range. The mist lowers fractionally again, smoothing small irregularities in the center channel. What earlier might have drawn the eye as contrast now blends into adjacent tone. Movement persists. Across the wide span, distance reads less as measure and more as presence. The far bank holds steady within the same tonal field as the water below it, separated only by a narrow variation in shade that shifts depending on the angle of view. The center channel carries deeper tone without interruption, while the edges absorb what little residual warmth remains near the horizon. Grass along the upper bank appears flatter in contrast, its texture subdued beneath gathering shadow. Air rests evenly across the surface of the river, not disturbing its breadth, but smoothing its finer distinctions. Nothing sharpens, nothing withdraws. Instead, the entire field compresses gently toward uniform depth, preserving form while reducing emphasis. Your steps continue in quiet sequence. The slope beneath your feet carries less visible gradient. Earlier variations in texture, small ridges, slight depressions, appear subdued beneath shadow. The seam remains active, though its phases merge more fluidly. A shallow advance gathers along the lower bank, filling a minor depression before easing back into the broader tide. The darker outline it leaves behind softens almost immediately, blending into surrounding shade. The rhythm of contact and retreat continues without pronounced markers. Sound follows a similar pattern. Foot against soil and water against mud no longer register as separate layers. The compression beneath your steps merges with the low modulation of the tide, forming a shared cadence that carries neither forward nor back. The slope beneath the path holds its gradual descent, though its gradient appears more unified under dimmer light. The sky deepens by another shade. Copper at the horizon is now only suggestion, a muted thread of warmth beneath steady blue-gray. No star interrupts yet. The field remains continuous. Your orientation remains clear, yet edges ask less of it. Path remains beneath you. River remains beside you. Horizon remains ahead. But their separation reads as variation rather than division. Across the span, a faint shift travels through the darker center channel, altering its surface briefly before dissolving. The effect is subtle enough that it could pass unnoticed without the stillness surrounding it. Shadow gathers more confidently along the lower bank. The slope merges more fully into waterline. Grass holds a final trace of pale tone before dimming further. Looking outward does not extend the field, so much as confirm its evenness. The horizon reads less as boundary and more as subtle tonal adjustment within a continuous plane. The darker center channel settles further into alignment with the deepening sky, while the shallower margins absorb the remaining light without reflecting it sharply. Shadow along the lower bank deepens another fraction. Grass along the upper edge dims without losing its outline. The mist resting above the river lowers slightly again, smoothing small irregularities that earlier might have drawn the eye. Movement continues, steady, undivided. Near the waterline, the seam advances once more, though the change registers only as a softening of shade rather than visible movement. The slope above it holds steady, its gradient subdued beneath evening's deepening tone. Across the span, the darker center channel and the dimming sky align more closely still, separated only by a slight variation in depth. Broad alignment of river, sky, and shore persists without interruption as evening lowers by another unmarked degree. The path continues beneath you, though its direction feels less pronounced now. What earlier carried the sense of travel begins to feel more like steady placement within a broad field of lowering light. Foot meets earth. Earth receives without resistance. There is no echo beneath the contact, only brief compression that settles almost immediately back into firmness. Along the lower bank, water reaches forward in another quiet adjustment. It touches the mud in a shallow curve, lingers long enough to deepen the tone, then eases back into the wider tide. The darker trace it leaves remains only for a moment before softening at the edges. Your stride maintains its interval, not altered, simply continuous. Across the open span, the darker midstream channel steadies further. Earlier variations that caught light now register only as slight shifts in shade. The shallower edges remain visible, though their contrast has reduced. Mist rests low above the surface, thin enough that form remains intact, yet present enough to soften small disruptions. Air passes across the river and along the bank in subtle layers. It does not disturb the breadth of the tide. It moves lightly, registering more as presence than motion. Sound settles further into the same range. The small compression beneath each step merges easily with the tide's low modulation. Neither overtakes the other. Both unfold within the same dimming span. Beneath the path, shadow gathers more confidently along the slope. Earlier textures, ridges in mud, faint depressions left by retreating water, now appear subdued rather than defined. Grass along the upper edge dims toward gray. Looking outward does not expand distance, so much as confirm continuity. The far bank remains visible, though its separation from sky reads as tonal distinction rather than edge. Breath continues without adjustment. Cooler air now distributes more evenly across open surfaces. The faint warmth rising from the ground recedes toward neutrality. Nothing sharpens, nothing withdraws. Near the shoreline, the seam advances again. A quiet reach, a brief hold, a gradual withdrawal. Each phase blends into the next without demanding attention. Your movement persists within that same measured field. The rhythm of your steps neither accelerates nor slows. It simply continues. Midstream, a subtle shift alters tone for a moment before dissolving into uniform shade. It is not wave or ripple, only slight redistribution of surface tension. The horizon dims by another fraction. Copper at its edge has thinned to suggestion beneath steady blue-gray. No star interrupts yet. Orientation remains intact, yet their separation feels less pronounced. The space between them carries less demand. Shadow deepens gradually along the lower bank. The slope merges more fully with the waterline, reducing contrast without removing form. Air grows quieter in quality. Sound thins further. Movement settles, not into stillness, but into shared range. Reeds along the bank register as darker vertical strokes against widening blue-gray. They no longer stand apart strongly from the field behind them. Depth reads less as separation and more as shared placement. Near and far remain distinguishable, though neither asserts priority. The path beneath your feet carries no more emphasis than the darker channel beyond it. Your stride continues, measured, unhurried. Underfoot, soil absorbs each step without rebound. Along the seam, water touches mud and withdraws again. Repetition feels less like return and more like continuation. Across the span, center channel, and margins settle further into alignment. The darker register midstream no longer contrasts sharply with the dimming sky above it. Both rest within similar depth of shade. Nothing disappears. No boundary collapses. The field compresses gradually while preserving its structure. The bend in the bank carries you forward, though the sensation of turning is faint. It feels less like redirection and more like land adjusting beneath you. Ground remains firm and responsive. Closer to the shoreline, water glides forward again, darkens the mud, then eases back. The mark lingers briefly, then softens. Nothing insists. The mist remains low and thin, allowing the breadth of the river to remain visible while reducing minor disturbances. Looking outward confirms evenness rather than distance. You continue at the same pace. The rhythm of your steps remains consistent within dimming light. River and path unfold independently, yet within the same span. A faint change in air crosses your hands, subtle enough to register as density rather than movement. Cooler layers now rest evenly across grass, water, fabric, and skin. Along the slope, earlier ridges soften further into contour. The seam continues its quiet exchange. Sound remains subdued. No metallic tone returns. Even the meeting of water and land registers more as tone than event. Breath stays steady. It does not deepen or shorten. It moves within the same range as air across the river. Across the open span, layered depth reads now as variation within shared shade. Near and far remain distinct, yet neither dominates. Grass dims toward muted gray. The horizon softens into suggestion. The river holds its breadth while internal divisions quiet further. Deeper water holds steady. Shallower margins absorb remaining light without sharp reflection. Air rests evenly. Movement continues. The curve ahead becomes continuation rather than turn. A faint shift crosses the center channel and dissolves without interruption. Your stride persists, unforced. Even, the path ahead carries the same quiet firmness it has held throughout, though its edges appear less distinct as light lowers. Grass and earth blend more gradually now, their boundaries softened by shadow rather than erased. Underfoot, small variations in the soil register only briefly before settling back into evenness. No loose gravel interrupts. No sharp ridge catches the edge of your step. The surface remains consistent, supportive without drawing attention. To your right, the slope continues its gradual descent toward the seam. What earlier showed subtle ridges pressed into damp mud now reads as broad contour. The tide approaches in shallow arcs, touching and retreating in measured intervals that feel neither hurried nor delayed. The darker midstream channel holds steady, not widening, not narrowing, simply present. Earlier tonal contrasts that separated depth from shallows have softened into a more unified field. The river's surface appears less textured, more continuous. A faint haze lingers low above the water, almost indistinguishable from the surface itself. It does not obscure, it moderates. Reflections shorten as remaining light thins, leaving the water less mirror-like and more absorptive. Your stride continues without deviation. There is no need to quicken or slow. Each step lands, settles, and releases in quiet sequence. Air rests more fully now. The earlier warmth of late afternoon has withdrawn into the ground, leaving only a faint residual trace that no longer competes with the cooler layer settling across the open span. Breath remains even. It does not require adjustment. It moves as steadily as the tide. Across the breadth of the river, distance feels less like measure and more like presence. The far bank no longer asserts itself as a separate destination. It rests within the same dimming range as water and sky. Shadow deepens another subtle degree along the lower bank. The seam remains visible, though its movements are less defined by contrast and more by tone. A thin advance of water presses forward once more, holds briefly, then withdraws. The darker impression it leaves lingers only long enough to register before softening back into the slope. A gentle curve carries the path forward again, though the sensation of turning feels diminished. Land and river follow one another in closely matched arcs, closely enough that travel along either seems continuous rather than directional. Midstream, a slight change in surface tension shifts tone momentarily. It is neither ripple nor wave, simply a redistribution that dissolves as quietly as it formed. Sound remains subdued. The faint compression beneath your feet merges easily with the low modulation of the tide. Even the subtle brush of air across grass registers more as continuity than interruption. Looking outward confirms alignment rather than expansion. River, sky, and shore share a closer tonal range than earlier. Copper at the horizon has thinned to muted rose gray. Blue deepens above it without sharp transition. Reeds near the bank stand darker against the softening field. Their outlines remain intact, though less insistent. Underfoot, the ground remains firm and responsive. It absorbs weight without echo. Each step settles into the same quiet interval it has held since the beginning of the walk. The shoreline continues its measured adjustment, though the individual phases no longer separate clearly from one another. Yet even these phases feel less distinct from one another than before. Near and far exist within similar depth of shade. The path beneath your feet carries no more prominence than the darker channel beyond it. The water's surface appears broader not because it expands, but because fewer variations interrupt its continuity. Air rests evenly across grass, fabric, skin, and water. The cooler layer that has been forming now holds steady without fluctuation. You continue walking, not toward anything specific, simply within the broad alignment that has formed. Along the lower bank, the slope merges more fully with the waterline. Earlier textures, pressed ridges, shallow depressions, now read as gentle contour beneath shadow. The wide tidal span maintains its measured exchange, holding its structure as tone lowers and contrast softens. The seam advances once more, nearly indistinguishable from the previous phase. Mud darkens and lightens again without clear line dividing the two states. River, sky, and shore deepen another quiet degree into alignment. Shadow gathers another quiet degree along the lower bank. The slope and waterline settle closer in shade, their distinction present but less pronounced. Across the span, darker midstream holds steady while the shallower margins absorb what remains of the fading warmth. The sky above deepens without abrupt shift. Your steps continue at the same measured pace. Underfoot, earth receives each contact without echo. Along the seam, water reaches forward again, then eases back, the change visible only as a slight adjustment in tone. Nothing alters direction. Nothing resolves. The curve ahead remains gradual. River and bank follow it together. Air rests evenly across open surfaces, carrying no new temperature, no change in quality. The horizon no longer asks to be marked. It simply remains. Movement continues. Evening lowers another fraction. Not an event, in shade. The path curves a little closer to the seam before widening again. Your pace reduces by a fraction. Not by intention. Simply because the ground ahead invites it. One step settles more fully than the last, then another. The interval between them lengthens. The slope to your right lowers gently toward the water, its gradient softened beneath deepening shade. Grass along the upper edge leans faintly toward the river's breadth, no longer silvered by light, but holding a muted gray tone. You take one more step, it lands, it settles, and you do not take the next one, you stand. Both feet placed evenly along the firm line of the path. The earth beneath you receives your weight without shift. It does not yield or slide, it holds. Behind you, the curve of the bank remains gradual. Ahead, it continues in the same direction it has carried you since the beginning of the walk. To your right, the seam advances again in a shallow arc, touches the lower bank, and withdraws. The darker impression it leaves blends quietly into the slope. The river continues. You remain. Air rests evenly across your face and hands. The cooler layer that has been forming now surrounds you without fluctuation. The earlier warmth rising from the ground has thinned to neutrality. No adjustment is required. Your shoulders rest in their natural alignment. Arms hang without effort at your sides. Fabric shifts faintly where it meets air, not from motion, but from the subtle settling of temperature. The darker midstream channel steadies further in tone. What earlier showed minor variations now reads as continuous shade. The shallower margins hold slightly lighter depth, though their contrast has softened. Mist rests low above the surface, almost indistinguishable from water itself. It does not thicken, it simply remains. The slope beside you continues its gradual descent toward the waterline. Earlier textures pressed into damp mud now read only as broad contour beneath shadow. Water reaches forward again. A quiet advance, a brief hold, a gradual withdrawal. The phase blends into the next without emphasis. Your breathing continues at the same measured pace it has held throughout the walk. It does not deepen because you have stopped. It does not shorten, it remains. Looking outward no longer extends space, it confirms it. The far bank holds steady as tonal variation rather than edge. The horizon above it deepens by another fraction, copper now only suggestion beneath steady blue-gray. Reeds near the seam register as darker vertical strokes against the dimming field. Their tips tilt slightly in the faint diagonal breeze that crosses the water, then settle again. You do not move. The river does, the sky does, light does. Underfoot, earth remains firm. There is no vibration through the soil, no tremor, no echo of passing current. The contact between soul and ground is steady and unremarkable. Another shallow reach of water presses into the lower bank. The mud darkens where touched, then lightens again as the tide recedes. The change registers as tone rather than motion. Your head remains level. Your gaze rests outward without fixing on any single point. Depth and distance read as layers within the same dimming field. Near and far retain their distinction, though neither draws emphasis. Air passes lightly across your skin, not wind, not stillness, a quiet exchange. The mist lowers by a fraction, smoothing small irregularities in the center channel. Reflections shorten further as remaining light thins. You stand within that shift, not interrupting it, not directing it, simply present along the upper line of the bank. The path beneath you continues forward, and behind, though for this moment it carries no sense of travel. It exists as placement. Another small adjustment travels across the darker midstream, too subtle to isolate as ripple. It alters surface tone briefly before dissolving into uniform shade. Shadow gathers slightly more along the lower slope. Grass at the upper edge dims toward muted gray, its outline intact. Your weight remains evenly distributed, ankles steady, knees relaxed, hips aligned without effort. The seam advances again, touches, withdraws. Evening lowers another fraction and deepens without announcement. You remain where you are as the river continues its measured exchange with the land, the wide field of water, sky, and shore settling into closer alignment around you without demand. And still, you remain. The ground beneath you carries a quiet firmness that feels unchanged by the lowering light. Earlier, it supported movement. Now it supports stillness with the same steadiness. There is no shift required to maintain balance, no adjustment through the hips or shoulders. The body holds itself without instruction. To your right, the slope continues its gradual descent toward the seam. Its contour appears smoother now, less articulated by contrast. What once showed faint ridges in damp mud reads only as soft curvature beneath shadow. Water reaches forward again, though the motion registers as tone before it registers as movement. A darker band gathers briefly along the lower edge of the bank, then eases back into the broader span. Air rests evenly across open surfaces, grass, water, fabric, skin. The cooler layer that settled earlier now feels complete, not shifting further, simply present. A faint movement passes across the center channel. Not a ripple, not a break. Just slight redistribution of surface tension that deepens shade momentarily before returning to uniformity. Your feet remain planted. Weight distributes without strain. The interval between breaths remains unchanged. Looking outward does not extend the scene. It confirms its breadth. River, sky, and shore hold within the same narrowing tonal range. The horizon softens another degree. What earlier carried faint rose gray now steadies into deeper blue gray without abrupt transition. Reeds along the bank register as darker lines against that field. A subtle diagonal breeze moves their tips, then settles again. The motion is delayed, resolved, complete. You do not follow it. The path behind you fades slightly in emphasis, though it remains clearly formed. Ahead, it continues its gentle arc, but for now it asks nothing. Another shallow advance gathers along the seam. Water presses forward, fills a slight depression in the mud, then withdraws with no clear boundary marking the change. The darker trace lingers briefly, then softens. Underfoot, the earth carries no vibration from the tide's movement. The connection between water and land unfolds at the lower bank without traveling upward through the soil. Stillness does not interrupt the environment. It exists within it. The darker midstream channel steadies further, its internal variations smoothing into broader shade. Shallower margins absorb what little warmth remains without reflecting it sharply. Mist rests low, nearly inseparable from the surface. It moderates contrast without obscuring form. Your shoulders remain level. Arms rest without effort. Hands carry faint residual warmth that no longer competes with the cooling air. The slope beside you deepens slightly in shadow. Grass along the upper edge dims but does not disappear. Its texture reads as suggestion rather than detail. The phases blend more fluidly than before. Evening lowers, not an event. In degree, the wide span remains intact. Distance feels neither nearer nor farther. It simply occupies space evenly. A small tonal shift travels across midstream and dissolves. The far bank remains as variation rather than boundary. Your posture does not alter. Balance does not require attention. Air passes again, faint, layered, brushing fabric lightly where it meets your arms. Nothing sharpens, nothing fades abruptly. Shadow gathers with quiet consistency along the lower slope. The seam continues its measured adjustment. You remain standing at the upper line of the bank while the river continues its slow exchange with the land. No internal shift occurs. No reflection rises, only presence. Water moves, light lowers, air settles, and you remain. The ground continues to hold you without demand. There is no subtle slide beneath your soles, no unevenness requiring correction. The surface feels consistent from heel through to the front of the foot, steady in its quiet support. The path, no longer something you are traveling along, reads simply as placement beneath you. Its curve remains visible in peripheral awareness, but it does not draw you forward. The river carries on in its slow exchange with the lower bank. The movement is present, yet it no longer registers as event. It reads as tone shifting gently against tone. A faint darkening gathers along the seam once more, then releases. The mud lightens gradually as water withdraws, leaving no defined edge to mark the difference. Your posture remains natural. No deliberate stillness, no held position, just standing. Air settles evenly along your face, across your hands, down the front of your body. The cooler layer feels complete now, neither increasing nor retreating. Across the span, the darker midstream holds its depth. The shallower edges absorb what remains of the fading light without shimmer. Reflections are shorter now, less articulate, more absorptive. The horizon softens another fraction, not fading, not disappearing, simply deepening. Reeds near the shoreline appear flatter against the dimming field. Their outlines remain intact but less pronounced. A faint breeze crosses once more, tilting their tips briefly before returning them to vertical rest. You do not move with it. Weight remains evenly shared between both feet, ankles steady, knees relaxed, shoulders level. The path behind and ahead exists without urgency. It continues, but it does not call. Evening lowers quietly around you. The wide field of river, shore, and sky remains aligned within shared shade. Water moves, air passes, light dims, and you stand within it unchanged, unhurried, present along the upper line of the bank as the tide continues its measured exchange below. The ground beneath you remains steady. Yet after a time, unmeasured weight begins to redistribute by the smallest degree. Not a step, not movement forward, simply a quiet easing from one foot into the other. The change is subtle enough that it does not disturb balance. It refines it. One heel settles a fraction more fully into the earth. The opposite knee softens almost imperceptibly. Hips adjust by the smallest measure to accommodate the shift. No strain, no effort, just a recalibration of placement. The river continues its measured exchange below. Water reaches the lower bank, deepens the mud in a shallow curve, then eases back again. The change registers as tone rather than motion. You do not follow it with your body, but the shift in weight allows the ground to feel slightly different beneath each sole. The foot that carries more now senses the firmness of the path more clearly. The other rests lighter, though not lifted. Air moves faintly across the open span. It passes along your sleeve, brushes the side of your neck, then disperses without direction. The darker midstream channel holds steady in depth. Its internal variations remain softened beneath dimming light. Another small adjustment at the seam. Advance, withdraw. No sharp boundary marks the difference. Your shoulders remain level, head balanced easily above the spine. The subtle redistribution completes itself without announcement. Balance settles again, even, unremarkable. Across the river, the far bank continues as tonal variation rather than edge. The horizon above it deepens by another fraction of shade. The mist hovering low above the surface smooths minor irregularities in the center channel. Your weight shifts back slightly, not returning to where it was, not moving forward, simply finding a new equilibrium. Underfoot, the path remains consistent in texture. No loose gravel shifts, no ridge presses upward. The firmness feels uniform from front to back. Water touches the lower slope again, lingers briefly, and recedes. The darker trace blends quickly into surrounding earth. Stillness does not resist movement around it. It exists beside it. A faint diagonal breeze crosses once more. Reeds tilt, then settle. Fabric at your side responds lightly, then rests again. The cooler air that has settled over the river holds steady, neither deepening nor retreating. Your hands remain at your sides, fingers loose, no tightening, no release. Both feet now share the ground in slightly altered proportion, though no outward sign marks the change. The wide field of river, shore, and sky continues lowering in shade. The seam adjusts once more. The slope absorbs shadow another fraction. Light thins, not abruptly. Gradually, nothing demands correction. Nothing requires movement. You remain standing at the upper line of the bank as water, air, and evening continue their measured exchange below. The adjustment in balance settles so fully that it almost disappears. Yet its effect lingers in the way one sole now presses more distinctly into the firmness of the path. The other foot rests lighter, not lifted, simply carrying less. The shift is not visible from a distance. It exists within the body's quiet geometry. A slight release through the lower back follows, not deliberate, just natural correction. Shoulders remain level, neck aligned without effort. The river continues its exchange below. Water darkens the seam briefly and withdraws. The slope absorbs the change without echo. You do not respond to the tide's rhythm with movement, but the subtle recalibration allows the ground to register more clearly through the foot that now bears more weight. The texture remains uniform. No ridge interrupts. No stone shifts. Air crosses again, lighter now. It brushes fabric near your elbow, then passes beyond you into the open span. The darker midstream holds steady. The shallower margins absorb remaining light without shimmer. Mist remains low, smoothing minor surface variation without thickening. Your weight eases again, this time not transferring fully, but distributing more evenly between both feet. Not symmetrical, balanced. Ankles adjust by a fraction. Knees soften imperceptibly. The adjustment completes itself without sensation of effort. The path behind and ahead continues to exist without urgency. It waits, it does not call. Another small tonal shift travels across the river's center, dissolving before it draws attention. Shadow deepens along the lower slope by another degree. Grass at the upper edge dims toward uniform gray. Your breathing continues without alteration. The interval between breaths remains consistent. The body's alignment holds without instruction. There is no sway large enough to notice. Only micro corrections that keep balance alive without breaking stillness. The redistribution of weight settles fully now. Both feet share the ground in quiet partnership, neither leading, neither retreating. Air rests evenly across your face and hands. The cooler layer feels complete. The field lowers another quiet degree. You remain upright along the upper line of the bank, posture natural, weight recalibrated as river and sky continue their gradual descent into deeper tone around you. A faint sway begins, not enough to be seen, only enough to be felt. It does not lean, it oscillates. A slow, natural arc through the ankles, so small it barely registers as motion. Forward by a fraction, then back, not to correct imbalance, to maintain it. The ground remains firm beneath both feet. The redistribution from earlier now feels integrated, no longer an adjustment, simply the way you are standing. The sway continues in a quiet rhythm, not mechanical, not deliberate, a living equilibrium. Air moves across the river in the same layered way it has all evening. It touches your sleeve, brushes your collar, passes on without gathering force. The river continues its exchange with the lower bank. Water deepens the seam briefly, then withdraws again, leaving tone where definition once felt clearer. Your body does not follow the tide, but the micro movement within your stance mirrors its softness. Forward a fraction, pause, back a fraction. Pause, the arc shortens, balance refines itself. Shoulders remain level, head steady, gaze resting outward without fixing. Across the span, darker midstream holds its depth while the shallower margins absorb the last trace of warmth. The horizon deepens by another degree, though the shift is so gradual it feels continuous rather than transitional. The sway diminishes further, an almost imperceptible settling through the hips. The body stands, not rigid, not slack, simply alive within stillness. Another faint breeze crosses diagonally. Reeds tilt, then resolve back into place. Fabric responds lightly, then rests. The movement within your stance quiets again, resolving into steady placement. Both feet grounded, weight shared. The small arc through your stance narrows further until it is barely distinguishable from stillness. Not rigid, not fixed, simply balanced. The body makes its quiet adjustments without drawing attention to them. A subtle softening at one ankle, a faint settling through the opposite hip. The corrections are so slight they do not register as movement, only as ease. Underfoot, the firmness of the path remains consistent. No grain shifts, no edge presses upward. The contact between soul and earth feels evenly distributed. The river continues below, its exchange with the bank unfolding without variation in pace. Water reaches forward in a shallow curve and recedes again, the darkened mud returning gradually to surrounding tone. You do not track the rhythm. Air carries a faint density now, cooler, steadier, resting against fabric and skin without stirring it. Your shoulders remain level. Your head does not tilt. The spine holds its natural alignment without effort. Another micro adjustment passes through the stance, almost imperceptible. The weight leans a fraction toward the outer edge of one foot, then returns to center. The movement is not directional, it is stabilizing. Across the span, the darker midstream remains uniform. The shallower edges continue absorbing the last of the dim light without shimmer. Mist rests low and unchanged. The horizon deepens another degree, not fading, not shifting abruptly, simply settling. Breath moves in the same steady interval it has held throughout. There is no deepening because you are still, no shortening because light lowers. It remains. The path behind you exists without emphasis. Ahead, its gentle arc continues but carries no urgency. A faint breeze crosses once more. Reeds tilt and return. The motion resolves quickly, leaving the field unchanged. The subtle sway within your stance quiets completely now. Balance holds, not because it is controlled, because it is natural. Both feet rest evenly along the firm line of the bank. The ground supports without demand, and you remain upright within that gradual lowering, neither resisting nor following, simply placed along the upper line of the shore as evening continues its measured descent. You remain upright along the upper line of the bank. The ground continues to hold you without demand, and within that steady field, a small shift occurs, not in posture, not in balance, but in awareness. The sound of the river, which has been present all along, becomes slightly clearer, not louder, more distinct. The low modulation at the seam separates subtly from the broader hush of evening. For a moment, the difference becomes clearer, not as event, as texture. Your breathing remains unchanged, yet the space around it feels more defined. The air entering carries the same cool density as before, but now its contact at the bridge of your nose registers faintly. Not sharp, simply present. Your hands rest at your sides. The weight of your fingers against fabric registers lightly, not because it has changed, but because attention brushes it for a moment. Across the span, the darker midstream remains steady. The far bank holds as tonal variation. The horizon deepens another fraction. Nothing shifts abruptly, but awareness settles slightly closer to where you are standing. The contact between soul and earth registers more clearly for a breath or two. Firmness, support, even distribution. The subtle sway that quieted earlier is no longer felt as movement, only as equilibrium. There is no need to define it, no need to hold it still. You simply remain there. A faint breeze crosses once more. You feel it first along the side of your neck, then along your sleeve, then it passes. The sequence is small, noticeable, complete. The river continues its measured exchange below. Water darkens the seam briefly and withdraws. This time the shift reads less as scenery and more as presence unfolding beside you, not closer, just recognized. Your gaze remains outward, unfixed, yet depth feels slightly less abstract. Midstream holds its deeper shade, while the shallower edges fade gently toward the horizon's dimming line. All of it remains unchanged. But your awareness rests within the field rather than skimming across it. Breath continues, even unaltered. The cooler air that settled earlier feels consistent along your face and hands. There is no urge to move, no urge to resume walking. Standing does not feel like interruption. It feels complete. The path behind and ahead continues without urgency. It exists. You are aware of that existence, not planning to follow it, simply recognizing it. Shadow gathers another quiet degree along the lower slope. Grass at the upper edge dims further into gray. The river's surface smooths as remaining light thins. You notice none of this as change, only as continuation. Awareness remains light, not inward, not outward, simply resting where you stand. Water moves, air passes, light lowers. For a time, you remain where you are. Awareness rests evenly across ground, air, and river. Then, without intention, weight leans forward by the smallest degree. Not enough to disturb balance, enough to suggest motion. One heel lightens, the opposite foot carries slightly more. The shift is quiet, unannounced. The body recognizes it before thought does. Your gaze remains outward. The river continues its measured exchange. Light lowers another fraction, and the forward lean deepens just enough for the back foot to release. It does not lift quickly. It unweights, then rises. The sole leaves the ground without sound. The step is shorter than those earlier in the walk. Measured, unhurried, it lands softly ahead along the firm line of the path. Contact, settle, weight transfers gradually. The second foot follows, not with urgency, but with the same restrained interval. The rhythm that had dissolved into stillness returns in a quieter form, slower, more deliberate. Awareness remains where it settled, not drifting inward, not projecting outward, simply accompanying the movement. The ground beneath each step registers clearly. Firmness, evenness, support. The slope to your right continues its gradual descent toward the seam. Water reaches forward and withdraws unchanged in pace. You walk beside it, not separate from it, not absorbed by it. The micro sway that held your balance while standing now becomes the forward arc of motion. The interval between steps lengthens slightly compared to earlier. Not heavy, not slowed by fatigue, simply unhurried. Air brushes across your face again, then passes on. Fabric shifts lightly with each step. Across the span, the darker midstream holds steady while the shallower edges absorb the final traces of dim light. The horizon deepens without abrupt transition. Your breathing remains even. It does not quicken because you move. It continues at the same steady interval. The path curves gently ahead. This time you follow it, not with urgency, with quiet continuation. Another step lands, settles, releases. The contact between soul and earth remains consistent, unchanged from when you were standing. The river continues its exchange below. Water touches mud, withdraws, leaves tone where edge once was. You walk beside that rhythm. Evening lowers another fraction, not by event, by shade, and your slower steps carry you forward along the upper line of the bank, awareness steady, movement quiet as river, air, and light continue their gradual descent around you. The rhythm settles into its new pace, shorter steps, longer intervals, not deliberate restraint, simply the way the body moves after standing. The foot that lifts does so without urgency. It leaves the ground as if releasing a thought that has already finished forming. The step ahead lands within a smaller arc than before, placing you closer to where you were than earlier in the walk. Awareness does not retreat as motion returns. It accompanies the contact. Heel touches first. Then the ball, then the full sole meets the path and receives your weight. There is no echo beneath the surface. The firmness remains consistent, unchanged by the lowering light. Another step follows. The interval between them feels wider than earlier in the evening, not stretched, not slowed by effort, simply unhurried. To your right, the slope continues its gradual descent. The seam darkens briefly where water reaches forward, then lightens again as it withdraws. The exchange remains steady, unaltered by your movement. You do not match its pace. You move beside it. Air crosses the open span and brushes your sleeve. The fabric shifts lightly with the forward motion of your arms, then settles back against your sides. Your gaze remains outward, unfixed. yet more grounded than before. Across the river, the darker midstream channel holds its depth. The shallower margins absorb the last trace of warmth without reflection. The horizon deepens another fraction. The motion is quieter now, not smaller, more integrated. The micro sway that kept balance while standing has become forward progression without losing its softness. The path curves ahead in the same gradual line. This time, the turn registers not as redirection, but as continuation. You follow it without thought. Another step lands. The contact feels distinct for a moment, the subtle texture of packed soil beneath the sole, then fades back into the wider field of sensation. Breath remains steady. Air cools evenly across your face. The body moves without commentary. No urgency to arrive anywhere. No sense of leaving what was behind. Only forward placement within the same dimming field. The river continues its measured exchange below. Water reaches, withdraws, leaves tone where edge once was. The phases blend into one another more smoothly now, just as your steps blend into one another without interruption. Light thins, not abruptly, gradually. Shadow gathers another quiet degree along the lower slope. Grass at the upper edge dims toward uniform gray, its outline intact. Another step. Weight transfers without pause. The second foot lifts, settles. The interval holds steady. You walk with an awareness rather than ahead of it. Each step meets the firm path without effort. Cool air brushes your skin as you move. The river remains beside you not as backdrop, but as steady presence within the same field. And your slower steps continue along the upper line of the bank, steady and unforced, awareness resting evenly within the movement as river, air, and light carry on beside you. The path continues beneath your feet, though its edges are less distinct now. Where grass once separated cleanly from soil, the boundary has softened into gradual shade. Nothing has altered in form. Light has lowered, reducing the contrast that once clarified each surface. Your steps remain slow, not restrained, simply smaller in their forward reach. Each foot meets the ground with the same steady firmness it has held throughout the evening. The texture beneath the sole does not change. What shifts is perception, detail thinning, outlines easing, the world compressing into quieter tones. To your right, the slope toward the river descends into deeper shadow. Earlier ridges and faint impressions in the damp mud now read only as contour. The seam where water meets land continues its steady exchange, but the phases are less defined. Darkening and lightening blend into one another until the movement feels continuous rather than sequential. You walk beside that exchange without matching it. Your pace neither quickens nor lingers. The interval between steps stretches by a small degree, though not enough to call attention to itself. The movement feels economical, contained within the narrowing field of evening. Across the water, the darker midstream channel no longer stands apart sharply from its margins. The entire span rests within shared depth. What once separated center from edge has softened into subtle variation. Air carries a cooler steadiness now. It rests evenly against your face, and hands, no longer layered with residual warmth from the ground. Fabric brushes lightly with each step, then settles back against your body without sound. A foot lifts. It leaves the earth without urgency. The step ahead lands within a smaller arc than earlier in the walk, weight transferring smoothly as the trailing foot releases. No echo follows beneath the surface. Ground remains consistent, supportive without drawing attention. Along the horizon, the last suggestion of copper has dissolved fully into blue-gray, the boundary between sky and distant bank softening into gradual blending. Your breathing continues at the same measured pace. Movement does not alter it. The rhythm remains steady, integrated with the unhurried progression of your steps. The river's sound lowers in emphasis, not in volume, but in prominence. It becomes part of the larger quiet rather than something distinct within it. Water continues to meet mud and withdraw, though the phases no longer register individually. Mist rests low above the surface, softening minor irregularities in the current. It does not thicken, it simply moderates. You continue walking, not toward destination, not retracing, only forward placement along the upper line of the bank. The path curves gently again, but the curve no longer feels directional. It unfolds beneath you without asking for attention. Your feet follow it naturally, adjusting by small degrees that require no thought. Another step settles. The contact feels slightly muted now, as though sound itself has softened with the light. Yet the firmness beneath remains unchanged. Across the river, distance feels less measurable. The far bank no longer asserts itself as a separate place. It rests within the same dimming field, present but undemanding. Air moves once more across your sleeve. The movement is faint, contained within the broader stillness. It passes without gathering force. Shadow deepens along the lower slope. Grass at the upper edge dims toward uniform gray, its texture preserved but subdued. Your arms swing lightly in restrained arcs, shorter than before. The forward motion is quieter, the arc of each step smaller. Evening does not arrive, it accumulates. The field narrows further, not closing in but consolidating. River, path, and sky settle within the same descending tone, none standing apart from the others. Another step settles, the soul meeting earth and releasing again without interruption. The rhythm feels integrated now, no longer distinct from the environment around it. Your movement does not interrupt the quiet, it belongs within it. Your gaze remains outward without searching for detail. What you see is less about objects and more about continuity, water blending into mist, mist into air, air into sky. There is no commentary forming, no narrative gathering, only the steady placement of one step after another. Along the horizon, color deepens gradually without visible transition. Reeds near the shoreline appear more silhouette than structure now. Their outlines remain, but their individuality softens into collective form. The interval between steps lengthens once more, though subtly. Your pace adjusts in response to the lowering light, not consciously, but naturally. The path feels narrower in emphasis, not because it has shrunk, but because surrounding contrast has reduced. Grass and soil blend more gradually into one another. Air rests evenly. The cooler layer feels complete. You continue. The river's modulation remains beneath the larger hush, steady and unbroken. Its rhythm does not call for attention. It exists alongside your movement without either dominating the other. Your shoulders remain level, your head balanced easily above the spine. No internal shift draws you inward. No external detail pulls you outward. The field has simplified. Another step. The heel touches first, then the full soul meets the earth. Weight transfers smoothly, without pause. The previous foot lifts and settles again ahead, maintaining the smaller arc that now defines your walk. Across the span, water and sky share nearly the same depth of shade. The distinction between them is present but softened. Mist hovers low, blending surface and air into one quiet plane. Your movement continues within that plane, slower than earlier. Contained, steady. The seam continues its exchange below, though its phases have nearly dissolved into uniform tone. The difference between advance and withdrawal feels less marked, more continuous. Firmness remains beneath you, steady and undemanding. Air brushes lightly along your face again, thinner now, as though the atmosphere itself has settled. The horizon no longer draws the eye. It rests where it is, uninsistent. You walk, not thinking, not analyzing. simply continuing along the upper line of the bank as evening gathers fully. Field compresses another degree, details thin, shadows merge, movement remains. And within that shared depth of tone, river, shore, sky, and path, your slower steps carry you forward without effort, without urgency, without departure from the quiet that has formed around you. Dimness now feels less like fading and more like settling. The remaining light no longer outlines forms clearly, it gathers them into broader shapes. What was once defined by edge is now defined by relation: water beside land, land beneath sky, sky lowering around both. Your steps continue at the same measured pace. They do not shorten further. They simply remain small. Contact beneath each foot feels familiar now, almost absorbed into the larger quiet. You no longer register the texture of the soil distinctly. It supports without asking to be noticed. The ground has become dependable enough to fade from awareness. To your right, the river's surface appears more continuous than before. Minor variations in current no longer separate into visible patterns. Depth reads as single tone rather than layered movement. Air rests evenly across your face and hands. It carries no direction and does not gather into breeze, remaining cool and steady against your skin. The interval between movements feels spacious, not stretched, not slow in a deliberate way, simply open. There is room within each transfer of weight. The path ahead no longer pulls the eye. It unfolds quietly, visible enough to follow, but softened enough to blend into the surrounding field. Across the span, the far bank dissolves slightly further into shade. Its separation from the water becomes subtle, though not lost. The distinction remains intact, only quieter. The river's sound feels farther inside the field now, not distant, simply less pronounced. Its modulation merges with the hush of evening until neither stands apart. Shadow deepens along the lower slope. The seam persists, though the darkening arc it leaves when water advances is barely perceptible now. Wet and dry earth read as slight tonal variation rather than change. Your arms move gently at your sides. The arc remains restrained, aligned with the smaller steps. Fabric brushes lightly against itself, then rests. Another foot lifts. It leaves the ground without hesitation. The step ahead lands within the same contained distance. Contact, weight settles, release. The repetition does not feel repetitive. It feels continuous, part of the same quiet descent. The sky lowers another degree. Blue deepens towards something nearly uniform. No star interrupts yet. The openness above feels wider because detail has thinned. You walk within that widening simplicity. There is less to distinguish, less to interpret. The field has reduced to essential presence: ground beneath, river beside, sky above, all held within a shared dimness. Your gaze remains outward without focus. There is nothing to search for. The eye rests within the softened shapes rather than moving across them. The path curves gently again. This time, the curve feels almost imperceptible. The shift beneath your feet registers as subtle change in angle rather than direction. Air continues to hold its cool steadiness. The earth beneath feels slightly denser now, not in substance, but in perception. Sound has lowered enough that the contact between soul and soil feels contained within the body rather than echoing outward. The river's breadth remains intact. Though detail has thinned, scale has not. It holds its quiet width beside you, expansive yet subdued. Your pace remains unchanged. The smaller arc of motion feels natural now, fully integrated. There is no sense of slowing further, no impulse to quicken. The movement has found its depth. Along the horizon, color blends further into the sky until it becomes suggestion rather than line. The separation between above and below remains, but it is understood more than seen. Evening no longer advances in visible increments. It gathers gradually and completely. Another step settles, heel meeting earth softly as weight transfers without pause. You walk within a field that has almost fully settled, where detail is secondary to tone, and tone is secondary to presence. The seam's exchange continues below, though its phases have become nearly inseparable from the surrounding dark. The difference between advance and withdrawal no longer marks itself clearly. Breath moves without adjustment. Air rests cool. Your posture holds easily. Path, river, and sky rest within one shared depth of quiet. And your slower steps continue along the upper line of the bank, steady and contained, as dusk settles fully into the space around you. By now, the distinction between water and sky has softened to the point where both rest within nearly the same depth of tone. The river remains visible, but only as breadth, its internal movement absorbed into shadow. You continue walking. Steps remain small, measured, placed within a contained arc that feels fully integrated. Nothing in your pace suggests arrival or departure. Movement belongs to the quiet as much as stillness did earlier. The path beneath you is visible enough to follow, though edges are suggested rather than outlined. Grass leans into soil without clear boundary. The curve ahead reads more as continuation than turn. Air has settled into a uniform coolness. It rests along your face and hands without stirring. Fabric shifts faintly with each step, then returns to stillness. Another foot lifts and lands. The contact feels muted, contained within the body rather than sounding outward. Weight transfers without pause. The trailing foot releases and settles again ahead. Across the river, the far bank has become depth rather than distance. Separation remains, though it is sensed more than seen. The horizon no longer draws the eye. It exists quietly where sky lowers into land. Sound has thinned further. The river's modulation remains present but feels absorbed into the larger hush. No single phase of its exchange stands apart now. Mist lingers low, merging surface and air into one softened plane. You walk within that plane. Breath continues at its steady rhythm. There is no urge to adjust it. The body moves without commentary. Shadow deepens along the lower slope. What once showed texture now reads as form without detail. The seam's movement is no longer distinct enough to follow, only continuous enough to know it persists. The path remains firm. Even in dimness, support is unquestioned. Your gaze rests outward, unfocused but present. There is little to distinguish now, and little need to. The field has simplified to ground, water, and sky sharing one steady shade. The interval between steps remains open, not delayed, spacious. You move within that space rather than through it. The sky lowers another degree. Blue deepens toward near uniformity. No star interrupts yet. The openness above feels vast because detail has thinned. Evening has almost completed its descent. Not fully night, but close enough that light no longer defines objects. It defines atmosphere. Another step, heel touches. Soul settles, weight shifts forward, no interruption. The rhythm does not change. Your shoulders remain level, posture easy. No internal adjustment draws attention. The river's breadth remains intact, though its edges blur slightly into shadow. Wet and dry earth differ only by tone now, not by visible boundary. Air rests cool and even. Fabric brushes lightly against your side, then quiets. The path curves again, though the curve registers only as subtle redirection beneath your feet. You follow it without thought. Movement feels less like travel and more like continuation within a narrowing field. Breath continues unchanged. There is no anticipation of stopping, no push to continue, only forward placement within a nearly settled dusk. Across the span, depth has become uniform. Variation still exists, but it no longer demands recognition. It rests quietly within the whole. Air grows slightly denser as temperature lowers another fraction. The shift is subtle, felt more along the hands than anywhere else. You continue walking, slower than earlier in the evening, though not slowing further. The smaller arc of each step now feels final in its adjustment. Shadow gathers fully along the lower bank. The seam's exchange has dissolved into continuous tone. The horizon is no longer line, but suggestion. The sky above feels wider as color deepens toward near night. Another step lands. Weight transfers. Release follows. The movement remains integrated with the quiet. Nothing sharpens. Nothing disappears abruptly. Everything settles together. You walk within that shared depth as evening reaches the threshold of night, your pace steady, your awareness undisturbed. The river's presence beside you softened into the same calm field that now surrounds ground, air, and sky alike. Night does not arrive in a moment. It completes what dusk began. By now, the last visible distinctions have softened into shared depth. Water, land, and sky remain present, yet none stand forward from the others. The field has unified. Your steps continue, smaller still in arc, though not consciously reduced. The ground beneath feels certain, unquestioned. You no longer register texture. Support has become assumed. Another foot lifts. It settles ahead within the same contained distance. Weight transfers quietly. The previous step releases without echo. The river beside you has become presence rather than movement. Its exchange with the bank continues, though its phases are indistinguishable now. Sound persists only as low continuity. Air rests cool along your face. Temperature has stabilized. Fabric brushes lightly as your arms move, then stills again. There is less to interpret, less to notice. The world has simplified to depth and placement. The path remains visible enough to follow, though its edges have nearly dissolved. Grass merges into soil without boundary. The curve ahead is sensed through the feet more than seen by the eye. Your breathing remains even, not guided, not adjusted, simply steady. Across the river, distance has become tonal variation. The far bank is no longer measured, it is understood. The sky above deepens further. Color has thinned into near uniform darkness, though not complete black. Openness remains. You walk within that openness. There is no urgency to stop, no effort to continue. Movement belongs to the field as naturally as stillness did earlier. Shadow now holds the lower slope completely. Where water meets land, difference exists only in density of tone. Mist remains low, though nearly invisible. It merges air and surface into one continuous plane. Another step, placement, release. The arc remains small, contained, balanced. The path beneath you feels narrower in perception, not because it has changed, but because the world around it has quieted. Air rests evenly. Sound remains low. Your posture stays easy. There is no internal shift pulling you inward, no outward detail calling you forward, only steady continuation. Night approaches fully now, not as arrival, as completion. The horizon no longer draws attention. It rests where sky lowers into land without clear division. Your steps maintain their quiet interval, each one placed within the same measured field. The river's presence persists beside you, absorbed into darkness, yet undeniably there. The field has reached near stillness without becoming empty. Depth remains, space remains. You continue walking along the upper line of the bank as night completes its descent. The movement no longer feels like travel, it feels like belonging. And within that dark, your steps carry on, steady, unforced, unremarkable, until motion itself feels as quiet as the field around it. Night completes its lowering without announcement. What remains visible now is shape rather than detail. The river holds its breadth in darkness, not defined by movement, but by the space it occupies. The bank beside you carries the same density of shade, steady and undisturbed. Your steps continue, measured, contained within the smallest forward reach they have held all evening. Each contact feels absorbed almost immediately into the surrounding quiet. Sound does not travel outward, it settles close. Breath remains steady. Cool air rests lightly along your face and hands. Temperature has found its depth. Nothing shifts further. There is no sense of leaving where you were, no sense of approaching anywhere else. Movement feels circular within the same field rather than linear across distance. The curve of the path is felt more than seen now. Your feet adjust subtly, following its line without instruction. Orientation remains intact, though detail has nearly dissolved. Across the span, the far bank reads only as darker presence within dark. Separation persists, but gently. Sky has deepened toward near uniform tone. Openness remains overhead, expansive yet quiet. You continue walking, not because you need to, because movement still belongs here. Ground beneath you remains reliable. Its firmness is assumed rather than checked. Texture has faded from attention, support has not. Water, land, and sky share the same depth of shade. Their differences exist quietly without emphasis. Air moves once faintly across your sleeve. It does not gather, it passes and dissolves into stillness. Breath continues, even unremarked. Your posture remains easy, neither held nor slack. Shoulders rest where they are, head balanced. Arms move within restrained arcs that match the smaller pace. Night now feels complete, not newly arrived, fully settled. The river's presence remains beside you, absorbed into darkness yet steady. Sound persists as low continuity rather than event. Another foot lifts, it settles ahead, weight transfers. The previous contact releases, the rhythm holds, nothing sharpens, nothing falls away. You walk within that openness. There is no effort to slow further, no impulse to stop. The movement has reached its natural depth. Path beneath your feet continues in quiet alignment. Grass merges into soil. Slope merges into river. River merges into sky. Distinctions remain, though softly. Air cool and steady. The field holds, your movement holds within it. And within that shared dark, ground beneath, river beside, sky above, your smaller steps continue in quiet succession, steady and unforced, until walking itself feels like part of the night stillness rather than separate from it. The tidal river continues as it always has. Its rhythm remains. You do not need to follow it, you are already within it. The night gathers, the quiet holds, and the rest will carry itself.